Hey there, hope everyone's doing all right. So today I want to talk about rondo form. Um, Last time we learned about compound ternary and about how our simple part forms combine to create a larger framework, the compound ternary. And while the compound ternary, as its name implies, is in 3 parts, our rondo is going to be in 5 or even 7 parts. I think it's worth taking a second to stop and define part in this context. Here we're just talking about a section of music. This doesn't have anything to do with uh, a voice in a musical texture. So 4-part harmony has nothing to do with a 5-part rondo. Music vocabulary is messy, but so the rondo was modeled on the French Baroque rondeau, an instrumental work where a refrain is weaved through several couplets or different episodes. This piece by Couperin is always a good example. So if you recall, compound ternary was set up a lot like what you see right here. Our A section, bars 1 through 8, we have a half cadence in measure 4. Our B section starts in measure 9 and continues through measure 15, where we have a da capo indication telling us to go back to A, giving us a B-A form. But if we look at the rest of the piece here, you can see that there are more digressions, there are more episodes here. So note the relatively short A and B here compared to the compound ternary that we've seen. Later composers will expand these parts, but A will occasionally remain short since it returns so often, just depending on the size of the A section that the composer chose to use. Otherwise, you can end up with a rondo that's unnecessarily long. So let's take a listen to this. There's a whole lot of trills, so get ready for that. So here's this Couperin piece, Monique. So as you heard, uh, the addition of extra parts allows the composer to explore different musical moods, ideas, and key areas. Um, and to maintain unity, the refrain recurs throughout between the contrasting ideas or the episodes, B, C, and D in this case. And this results in a form that looks a little bit like this. In this class, we'll use the number of parts to describe a rondo. So for instance, a 5-part rondo or a 7-part rondo. But sometimes you'll often hear it described as a second or third rondo. The second or third in this case refers to the number of episodes. So a 5-part rondo is going to have 2 episodes, A, B, A, C, A. And we would call that a second rondo or a 5-part rondo. Likewise, the 7-part rondo would be called a third rondo. In this class, we're mostly going to be looking at the classical era rondo. And the classical era rondo was often placed at the end of a multi-movement work as kind of a light finish on a more complex or serious form, like a sonata form, for instance. Classical rondos are going to have more connective material between the refrains and the episodes. You'll sometimes have transitions that lead away from the refrain or the A, and then you'll often have retransitions that move back from one of the episodes to the A. Also, codas are usually present at the end of the last refrain to kind of wrap things up. By that point in the piece, if you hear the refrain again, you might be expecting another episode, but the coda kind of lets you know that no, this piece is ending. So I want to take a look at one of my favorite rondos, and this one's by Haydn. This is from Sonata in D major, the last movement, of course. So let's go ahead and take a listen to this. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. But one of the best ways I like to start, especially when looking at rondo forms, is to obviously listen. But then as I listen, I kind of just make note of where that familiar theme, that refrain, that A part returns. And that's going to give me a big clue as to where the other sections are. And since there are a number of parts, it might be more helpful to write them in list form, which is what I'll do here. We've written out our phrase diagrams with more detail to gain an understanding of how motives and figures translate into larger structures. But now that we're looking at larger forms, a list view might be a little bit more insightful. So as we would expect, he starts out with the A section. Here he has, in the first 8 bars, he has a modulating contrasting period. We end on the dominant in measure 8. In measures 9 through 12, we have a phrase ending on a half cadence there in measure 12 before he begins with the main idea again in measures 13 through 20. This short-term return brings back the original idea and ends it in the correct key of D major. And so when we look at this this first part, this A, our refrain is going to be in ternary form. Now, this is just the A section. In the B section, he quickly moves to the parallel minor, right there in measure 21. And this contrasts very sharply with what came before. We see here from measures 21 to 28, he gives us a modulating sequential period, or you could call it a modulating sequential period. We have a sequential period, we have a half cadence there in measure 24, and then he finishes this in the key of F, which would be the relative major of our parallel minor of our primary key. Is everybody following here? And then in measure 29 to 40, we have another modulating contrasting period here. He has to come back to D minor. He does that right there in measure 37 to 40. And so when we look at this section, we see a continuous binary form. We have our capital letter A from measure 21 to 28, and then we have our capital letter B from measure 29 to 40. So this would give us a continuous binary form for our boxed B, for our larger B. In measure 41 through 60, we just have a restatement of the first 20 bars, as we would expect, of the first boxed A. This is our refrain. We're coming back to it. There's not a whole lot that needs to be said here, other than it's just a restatement of the A. Now, in measure 61, we start our new episode, and this one's in the subdominant key of G. From measures 61 to 68, we have just a simple parallel period. We've got a half cadence there in measure 65, and then a perfect authentic cadence there in measure 68. From measures 69 to 72, we have a phrase ending in a half cadence before the capital A comes back in measure 73, and this is a parallel period just like the first A that started in measure 61. And so here we'd have a ternary form, a simple ternary form, and that would form our boxed C section here. If you notice in measure 80, he has a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G, and our primary key is in the key of D, so we need to get back to that somehow. So for measures 81 through 93, he has a retransition. So for measures 81 to 87, we just have a phrase. And when you notice there in measure 87, we basically just have a half cadence. And then after that half cadence, we have a cadential extension. He just kind of sits there on that A and leaves us in suspense, maybe, if you recall the Beethoven scherzo that we looked at last week, Haydn was Beethoven's teacher, so you can kind of see where he learned that technique. Okay, so this is after our retransition. Now we're back in the key of D and measure 94, and wouldn't you know it, we hear the A section again. But this last A is going to be a little bit different. Measures 94 to 101 are just like measures 1 through 8, but instead of a repeat bar here, he writes out the repetition because it is a varied form of the repetition. If you notice in measures 102 to 109. In measures 110 through 113 are just like measures 9 through 12, but varied. And then we have in measures 114 through 121, those are just like measures 13 through 20, also varied here. Measures 122 through 125 are similar to 110 to 113, and then 126 through 134 is like 114 through 121. So he's basically reaffirming the A, right? He's taken us to these two different episodes, but here he's reaffirming that refrain and making sure that we hear that refrain. You notice in measure 102 we hear that Alberti bass. Those 16th notes really pick up the rhythmic momentum, and this almost starts to sound like a coda, although I'll stop short of saying there's a definitive coda here. He does extend this boxed A section to have a little bit more emphasis. So it could be said that this extended A has a coda at the end. So as we look at rondos, keep in mind that towards the late classical and early romantic, composers continued to expand the form. And so it might not fit as neatly as, say, this Haydn or the Couperin piece that we looked at. But that doesn't mean they're not rondos. They just might not have double bars and repeat signs telling you this is your big boxed A or this is your big boxed B. So do watch out for that as you study these rondos.